Welcome back to our channel. Sheriff Jake Thompson was enjoying a peaceful morning in his recliner, coffee in one hand and the TV remote in the other, when an aggressive knock at the door shattered the calm. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not the kind pounding like they were trying to break in. With a sigh, he set his coffee down and walked to the door. The sight that greeted him almost made him laugh. 3 men in ill-fitting uniforms stood on his porch, chests puffed out like they were about to raid a criminal hideout. The tallest man, middle-aged with a thick mustache and mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward, flashing a shiny badge that looked more like a toy store novelty than an official department badge. "Sir," the mustache man said in a deep, authoritative voice, "we need you to step outside immediately." Jake raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "And who might you be?" "We're with the HOA enforcement unit," the man announced, his 2 lackeys nodding seriously behind him. "You've violated multiple neighborhood ordinances and we're here to bring you in," the mustache man declared. Jake stared at them for a long moment, trying to decide if they were joking or just incredibly stupid. "The HOA has an enforcement unit now?" he asked, playing along. "We do," the mustache man said, lifting his chin. "We don't tolerate noncompliance." Jake was almost in disbelief. The HOA had always been a little overzealous, but this was next-level nonsense. The mustached man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, dramatically flipping it open. "You've been cited for an unapproved mailbox design," he said, his voice full of artificial authority. "And unauthorized lawn furniture." Jake blinked, glancing at the standard black mailbox at the edge of his driveway. "My mailbox?" He looked over at the 2 perfectly normal Adirondack chairs on his porch. "And my lawn furniture?" "It doesn't conform to the HOA's latest aesthetic guidelines," one of the lackeys added, looking down at his clipboard as if reading from a script. Jake fought the urge to smirk. "So let me get this straight, you're trying to arrest me for a mailbox and patio chairs?" "This isn't a joke," the mustache man snapped, stepping forward. "Non-compliance with HOA ordinances is a serious matter. You're coming with us." Jake folded his arms. "And where exactly are you planning to take me?" "To our holding facility." Jake burst out laughing. "You mean the HOA has a jail?" The mustache man's face turned red. "It's not a jail. It's a compliance sentence." Jake took a slow breath, rubbing his jaw. "I see," he said, pretending to think it over. "Well, gentlemen, I hate to break it to you, but I'm a little busy today, so I'll have to decline your invitation." The mustache man's patience snapped. "That's it," he barked. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Jake didn't move. "Or what?" One of the lackeys stepped forward, pulling out a cheap pair of handcuffs that looked like they'd break if you sneezed too hard. "Do it now, sir, or we'll be forced to take action." Jake sighed, shaking his head. "All right." He turned slightly, reaching down to his hip. Not for a weapon but for the small radio clipped to his belt. With a quick press of the button, he sent out a silent distress signal to his deputies, all without breaking eye contact with the so-called officers. The mustache man grinned, clearly thinking he'd won. "That's right," he said smugly. "You're learning your place." Jake held back a chuckle. "I know my place." As soon as the lackey stepped forward to slap the flimsy cuffs on Jake, he moved in a single swift motion, grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and spun him toward the nearest car. The man yelped as his face smacked against the hood. The mustache man staggered back. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake glanced at him, still holding the struggling man in place. "Performing a citizen's arrest." The second lackey reached for something on his belt, probably a fake citation book or another laminated sheet of nonsense, but froze as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Within seconds, real police vehicles skidded to a stop, lights flashing. The HOA officers looked like deer caught in headlights. Jake leaned in close to the man he had pinned. "Now let's talk about who's really under arrest." The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the houses as 2 squat cars came to a stop in Jake's driveway. The mustache man and his lackeys looked like they had just been caught breaking into a bank. Their self-assured posturing vanished the moment Deputy Carter stepped out of his vehicle, one hand resting on his duty belt. Carter took in the scene, Jake still holding one of the fake cops pinned against the hood of a car, and the other 2 standing frozen in place. He raised an eyebrow. "Boss, you mind telling me why you're wrestling with a guy wearing what looks like a Halloween police costume?" Jake finally let the squirming man go, stepping back and brushing his hands off. These 3 gentlemen were in the middle of conducting an unlawful arrest. Figured I'd save them the trouble of doing it the hard way. Carter let out a low whistle, turning to the trio. All right, let's see some IDs. The mustache man tried to regain his composure, straightening his cheap polyester uniform. There's been a misunderstanding. We are authorized HOA enforcement officers, and we were carrying out our duties. Carter stared at him for a moment, then slowly reached out and plucked the man's shiny badge from his chest. He turned it over in his hands, examining the poorly engraved letters that read, HOA Compliance Officer. He looked back up at Jake. This is a joke, right? Jake smirked. I wish. The mustache man puffed up his chest again. We have full legal authority to issue citations and enforce community standards. Carter remained unimpressed. Yeah, and which department issued these fancy badges? The man faltered. The Homeowners Association's Security Division. Carter snorted. That's not a thing. The second lackey, still rubbing his wrist from Jake's takedown, jumped in. It is. We were given jurisdiction over all properties in this neighborhood. Carter tilted his head. Jurisdiction, is that right? He turned to Jake. Boss, did you sign off on that? Jake smiled. Nope. Carter gave the mustached man a long look. Well then, I guess you're just some guys running around playing dress-up. The mustache man shifted uncomfortably. Look, we were just following orders. Jake narrowed his eyes. Whose orders? The man hesitated. The HOA board. Jake crossed his arms. Got any paperwork to prove that? The second lackey quickly pulled out a crumpled document, handing it over. Carter took one look and scoffed. This isn't a contract. It's a volunteer neighborhood watch form. Jake glanced over it, shaking his head. So let me get this straight. You three decided you could run around pretending to be cops and extorting homeowners. The mustache man's lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't extortion. It was community enforcement. Jake gave him a hard stare. How much were you charging people for these violations? The lackeys exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Jake exhaled through his nose. Deputy, let's check their vehicle. Carter nodded and walked over to the HOA-branded SUV parked by the curb. He opened the door and rifled through the contents. A moment later, he let out a low whistle. Well. We've got ticket books, fine notices, and would you look at that, a cash box. Jake turned to the mustache man. You running an HOA or a roadside scam? The man swallowed hard. We were just collecting fees. Jake shook his head. No, what you were doing was fraud. The second lackey blurted out. We were told. Jake exchanged a glance with Carter. Told by whom? The board promised us a cut, the lackey mumbled. Carter flipped through a ledger he had pulled from the SUV. They've been hitting the whole neighborhood. Fake fines, intimidation tactics, even threats of foreclosure. Jake let out a slow sigh. And people actually paid them? Carter nodded. Looks like it. Jake turned back to the three men. Here's what's going to happen. You're all being detained while we investigate. If you're lucky, you'll just be looking at fraud charges. If we find out you threatened or coerced anyone into paying, it's going to get a whole lot worse. The mustache man tried to protest. You can't arrest us for enforcing community rules. Jake gave him a dry look. Watch me. Carter stepped forward, pulling out a set of real handcuffs. All right, boys. Turn around. The mustache man opened his mouth to argue, but when Carter raised an eyebrow, he slowly complied. The two lackeys followed, both looking thoroughly defeated as Carter cuffed them and started reading them their rights. Jake turned to look at the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered to watch. Some were whispering to each other, others shaking their heads. An older woman near the front of the crowd called out, Sheriff, does this mean we can ignore those fines they've been giving us? Jake gave her a reassuring nod. If they ever made you pay, keep your receipts. The county prosecutor's going to want to see them. A murmur spread through the crowd as more people stepped forward, each with their own horror story about the fake HOA cops. Jake looked back at Carter. We need to have a chat with the HOA board. Carter grinned. Oh, I can't wait for that. By the time Jake and his deputies arrived at the HOA office, word had already spread. The board members were waiting for him, looking nervous but determined to put on a good show. The president, a thin man in a suit that seemed one size too big, stood in front of the others with his hands clasped in what he probably thought was a dignified pose. Sheriff, the man said with a forced smile, this is all a misunderstanding. Jake crossed his arms. A misunderstanding? You mean the part where your so-called officers tried to arrest me, or the part where they were running a fine collection racket? The president cleared his throat. We were simply trying to maintain order in the community. There have been complaints. Jake cocked his head. Complaints about what exactly? The president hesitated, then gestured vaguely. Non-compliance. Jake smirked. You mean mailboxes and patio chairs? A woman with short silver hair, another board member, spoke up. Sheriff, we have to enforce neighborhood standards. People buy homes here because they expect a certain level of decorum. Jake glared at her. Does decorum include hiring unqualified thugs to shake down homeowners? The silver-haired woman stiffened. They were simply volunteers. Jake pulled out the fake citation book from the so-called HOA police. Volunteers who were charging fines, threatening arrests, and pocketing cash. That's not volunteer work. That's fraud. The board members shifted uncomfortably. The president tried to salvage the situation. Look, maybe we got a little overzealous, but surely we can handle this internally. There's no need to involve law enforcement. Jake let out a low chuckle. Too late for that. Your boys are already in cuffs, and we've got plenty of evidence. If I were you, I'd start thinking about a lawyer. The president's smile faltered. Surely there's a way to resolve this amicably. Jake took a step closer. You want amicable? Start by refunding every single dollar these guys took from homeowners. Then we'll talk about what happens next. The silver-haired woman sniffed. This is outrageous. The HOA has operated this way for years. Jake gave her a hard look. Yeah, well, that ends today. By the time Jake walked out of the HOA office, the board members looked like they had just been handed a death sentence. He knew they weren't getting away with this, not if he had anything to say about it. Back in the neighborhood, the scene had turned into something of a block party. People were out on their lawns, chatting animatedly, swapping stories about their encounters with the fake cops. Some were laughing, others were fuming. An older man in a golf cap approached Jake. Sheriff, I got fined $200 last month for excessive yard decorations. He gestured to his modestly decorated lawn, which had nothing more than a bird feeder and a small garden gnome. A younger woman stepped up next. They charged me $300 for parking my car in my own driveway overnight. Another neighbor groaned. I had to pay $500 because my grass was an inch too high. They threatened to double it if I didn't cut it within 24 hours. Jake shook his head. Y'all are getting your money back, one way or another. The crowd erupted in cheers. Someone even popped open a beer and handed it to Jake, who accepted it with a grin. Deputy Carter wandered over, looking amused. This might be the first time I've seen a sheriff's investigation turn into a community festival. Jake took a sip of his beer. People love seeing justice served. Carter smirked. Well, you're about to love this. Just got word from the prosecutor's office. They're looking into felony fraud charges against the whole HOA board. Jake raised an eyebrow. Now that's music to my ears. Carter held up a file. Oh, and it gets better. We checked the HOA's financial records. Guess who's been skimming money off the top? Jake leaned in. Don't tell me. Carter grinned. Your buddy in the cheap suit. The HOA president's been pocketing thousands. And guess where a chunk of that money was going? Right into those fake cops' pockets. Jake let out a low whistle. Well. Looks like we're going to be making another set of arrests. It didn't take long. Within hours, the HOA president and his accomplices were being hauled into squad cars, looking just as stunned as the fake cops had been. The neighborhood residents gathered to watch, some even clapping as the handcuffs clicked into place. As Jake leaned against his truck, watching the last of the arrests, the older man in the golf cap wandered back over. Sheriff, you ever thought about running for mayor? Jake laughed. I think I'll stick to law enforcement. The man winked. Well, if you change your mind, you've got my vote. Jake just shook his head with a chuckle. Let's get this neighborhood back to normal first.